Здравствуйте! Как вы поживаете? Рад вас видеть. I'm practicing for the future. Actually, when I was in 7th grade, I had the opportunity to take Russian as an elective language. And I thought, well, that's novel. And maybe someday it'll come in handy. Of course, I had not envisioned a situation where reading The Master and Margarita made more sense than reading the New York Times. But anyway, here we are. And here we are. How are you? It's nice to see you. Good evening. And in case you don't speak Russian, that's actually what I said. And if you heard me say it, please raise your hand so that I know that I'm not just sitting here talking to myself. Yay, raised hands. Okay, Amy, Nilamadova, Casey, Jess, Mary, Teresa, thank you all very, very much. All of you who are joining here, even as I speak. I see people joining us, and I know that people are joining after the fact. If you're new to the Satsang, my name is Hari-kirtana. I am here to share with you my experience of the Bhagavad-gita and hopefully connect the Bhagavad-gita to something meaningful in our lives, like what's going on in our lives right now, be it on the global stage or just the particular personal stage of our lives. We will quickly take care of some of the rest of our housekeeping. So here we go with that. You've already raised your hands. Thank you very much for doing that. You can adjust your audio settings up in the corner, as well as your viewing options. You don't have to worry about your mic or your camera because you can see me, presumably, unless you're just listening to the audio. I cannot see or hear you, but you can type a question into the question box. So I will be keeping an eye on that. If Teresa, please make sure that it's working for you and ask me a question or just state your question in the form of a statement or something just to let me know that you've got access to the Q&A box. While I wait for that particular confirmation, last week, the yoga of knowledge. We talked about the transmission of transcendental knowledge, the reason for Krishna's appearance, and we also spoke a little bit about spiritual language as both symbolic and literal. Thank you. And we're going to return to that particular topic this evening. As we move forward this evening, we will continue with the yoga of knowledge. We'll speak about some consistent principles of spiritual life, the unlimited varieties of reciprocation, and modeling the behavior of sadhu. So tonight we're going to cover verses 10 through 15 in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad-gita. But first, we're going to go back and revisit last week's verses in terms of literal and figurative or symbolic language in spiritual life. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read each of the verses that we covered last week again. And whereas last time I emphasized the literal aspect, this time I'm going to go through it again, but with a little more emphasis on the symbolic aspect, the significance of the symbolic understanding of the verses and how that relates to our lives. So we began at the beginning of the 4th chapter of Bhagavad-gita. Verse number 1, the Blessed Lord said, I taught this imperishable science of yoga to Vivishvan. Vivishvan spoke it to Manu, and Manu, in turn, taught it to Ikshvaku. So from the standpoint of symbolic language, we can think of this as indicating that the Gita is a representation of wisdom from a spiritual tradition that precedes the Gita's own composition. Now, this is also our understanding with the Yoga Sutras, that Patanjali is presenting the teachings of yoga, but the commentators all agree, as well as modern scholars, that Patanjali is systematizing something that already exists, that went before. So similarly, we can understand that the Gita is a teaching that has been extant in human civilization prior to its composition in the modern sense. In other words, it's old. So even if one puts aside the specifics of is there or is there not someone named Vivishvan who happens to be the deity of the sun, or a person named Manu who is the ultimate progenitor of mankind, etc. We can simply understand it like that. So the second verse, visionary kings received the supreme science through a chain of disciplic succession. Over the course of time, this succession was broken, and thus the science of yoga has been lost, O subduer of enemies. So this one doesn't have, at least to my mind, a lot of symbolic action going on here. It's something that has literal significance, though, the idea that there is a system in place specifically designed to transmit transcendental knowledge. A teacher teaches a student who then becomes a teacher, who teaches a student who then becomes a teacher, and on it goes. And it all rolls back to one original teacher, who is Krishna himself, or Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras, the original seed of omniscience and the teacher of the ancients who is beyond the reach of time. Now, I thought about this over this past weekend. I was up in Frederick, Maryland at Soul Yoga, which is someplace I love to go and visit and speak with people who are enrolled in their yoga teacher training programs, as well as people who are interested in yoga philosophy for the sake of deepening their practice, their understanding of yoga, and their ability to share yoga with others. And this is something that came up because I asked around and said, when we think of liberation, what do we mean by that? Or something to that effect. And as we went around the room, people offered their ideas, and I asked follow-up questions. Well, where'd you get that idea from? Well, where does that conception come from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens is, as often as not, the ultimate authority of yoga is us. We're actually deciding what these things mean, and we really can't point to a particular teaching or a particular teacher who has verified that our conception of a particular concept of yoga philosophy is accurate. We take ourselves to be the ultimate authority. Well, we're the ultimate decider of whether or not we think something is true or we experience it as being true. Direct perception is one of the valid sources of evidence for understanding the truth, but it's just one, and our senses are imperfect. Therefore, we can't rely entirely on our senses as an accurate source of information. So we need to cross-check this with verbal testimony, otherwise known as yoga wisdom texts, and teachers, and logic. Does it make sense? If anyone of you has an idea of how this last verse about how knowledge, transcendental knowledge, is passed from teacher to student, who becomes a teacher to a student, et cetera, this idea of parampara, one after the other, disciplic succession. If you've got an idea about how that could be understood in a symbolic way, please add that idea to the Q&A box, because I would be happy to entertain any thoughts you might have about how we would understand this in a symbolic way. Of course, don't be too surprised if I ask you where you got that idea. Text number 3. Today I am teaching you this same ancient science of yoga. I am revealing this transcendental mystery to you because you are my devotee as well as my friend. So symbolically, the condition of the heart is more important for the reception of transcendental knowledge than the strength of the intellect. Notice the qualification here, because you are my devotee and my friend. Therefore, I am favorably disposed to sharing this very, very important information with you. So this is worth thinking about, that it is not so much a matter of one's intelligence that allows one to understand yoga philosophy, it's the quality of our intelligence. There is the story of Sri Chaitanya, who was wandering across, not wandering, but traveling rather across India, going to village. And he came upon a village where there was an illiterate Brahmin. And the literate Brahmins made fun of him because they knew he couldn't read, but yet, in spite of this, every day he would sit down with the Bhagavad-gita, and he was so completely ignorant with regard to language that he was holding the book upside down when he tried to read it. He had no idea about the direction of the text or the orientation of the text. And while he read the Bhagavad-gita, so to speak, he was crying. And Sri Chaitanya went to him and asked, I understand that you are not actually able to read the Bhagavad-gita, and yet you are sitting here with it, and you have this intense emotional reaction. How is this? And the illiterate Brahmin explained, yes, it's true. I know they make fun of me because I sit with the Bhagavad-gita and I cannot read it. But I see this drawing of Krishna driving Arjuna's chariot, and I see how God loves his devotee so much that he desires to serve him by being his driver. And that actually makes my heart feel intense spiritual emotions about how wonderful and compassionate the Lord Krishna is. And so it brings tears to my eyes. And Sri Chaitanya declared, you actually understand the Bhagavad-gita, whereas all of these intellectual Brahmins who are discussing the philosophy on such a high level, they do not understand as deeply as you. So, something important to consider. The condition of our heart outranks the power of our intellect when it comes to having access to a deeper understanding of what is truly significant here in these texts. Text 4. Arjuna said, Vivishvana is senior by birth to you. How am I to understand that in the beginning you instructed this science to him? Here, the implication of the question is that the Gita is transcendental knowledge, that it must originate in transcendence or beyond the realm of time in order for it to be possible for Krishna to have spoken this science in the beginning, that is to say, at the dawn of creation. If this science must have come from someplace beyond this creation, if it was already immediately available and established at the time of creation. Text number 5. The Blessed Lord said, you and I have passed through many births. I remember all of them. You, O subduer of the enemy, do not. So the symbolic language here is that this indicates the existence of an omniscient superconsciousness who is not us. And one has to ask, well, is Arjuna speaking to himself, his true self? There are some people who will interpret the Bhagavad-gita as being one person having a conversation with his higher self. And it's actually Arjuna taking his own advice when he hears from Krishna. So one has to ask, if we were to make this kind of symbolic interpretation, does that actually make sense? We apply logic and verbal testimony to this interpretation to see if that makes sense. I don't think it makes sense. Text number 6. Although I am by my very nature unborn, imperishable, and the Lord of all living beings, I appear in every millennium by my own power, standing within and yet presiding over my material energy. So, I'm not sure what that means symbolically. However, here's something to consider. If Krishna appears standing within his material energy, then, well, what is that material energy composed of? We've discussed how there are 8 material elements: solids, liquids, radiant energy, gases, and space, traditionally known as earth, water, fire, air, and ether. But there are 3 others: the mind, the intelligence, and the ego are all counted in the category of matter. And what Krishna is saying here is that he can, by his own will, appear within any of these material elements. So, for example, if one is meditating on Krishna and Krishna appears within one's mind, well, that is not a figment of one's imagination. If one desires to see Krishna, Krishna can appear within the mind of one who is devoted to him and meditating on him. This is an authentic spiritual experience. We're going to come back to this idea as we move into the verses that we are officially covering tonight. Our next verse. 7. O descendant of Bharat, whenever and wherever righteousness declines and irreligion ascends, at that time I personally appear. To protect the saintly and destroy the wicked, as well as to reestablish the principles of religion, I appear millennium after millennium. So, from the standpoint of symbolic language, this condition could indicate not just what is in the external world, but what is within our own hearts. That is to say, if our own righteousness declines and irreligion descends within us, or if our saintly character becomes covered over by materialistic consciousness, then to reestablish the principles of religion within our own hearts, Krishna can appear once again by the request of one who desires for him to appear and do such a thing. There is a particular incarnation of Vishnu, Lord Nrsingadev, the half-man, half-lion incarnation, who is specifically called upon by the devotee of Lord Nrsingadev to enter into the heart of the devotee and destroy all materialistic tendencies. This will also relate to a verse that we're going to cover in just a few minutes that we planned for this evening. We, as in you and me, we collaborated on this. And then the last verse from last week. O Arjuna, one who knows the truth about the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving their body, take birth again. In this material world, they come to me instead. So, symbolic language? Well, one who understands all the ways in which divinity appears and moves in the world is in a state of spiritual consciousness. We can play a game with ourselves. We can look for divinity everywhere in every manifestation of nature. And by looking, gradually whatever veil of illusion that covers our spiritual vision is taken away simply by virtue of the desire being there and the action of looking, of having the intention to see with spiritual vision. All right. If you have any questions about this revisitation of last week's verses for the sake of looking at them more through the lens of symbolic language as opposed to literal language, please go ahead and type your questions into the question and answer box, and I will keep an eye out for them. This week's verses are 10 through 15. I will read through them, and then we will go back and look at them in some detail. So here we go. Verse number 10. Free from attachment, fear, and anger, their minds fully absorbed in me, and fully situated within me as their shelter, many have become purified by the fire of knowledge, and have thus attained my mood of intimate affection. However one approaches me, I respond to them in just that way. Everyone in all circumstances follows my path, O son of Pritha, Arjuna. Text 12. In pursuit of the perfection of their worldly desires, people worship their deities through acts of sacrifice. In the human realm, such fruitive work is quickly met with success. Verse 13. I created the 4 social orders of human society, which are divided according to the qualities one acquires and the actions one performs. You should know that although I am the creator of this system, I have no position within it, for I am eternally transcendental to such qualities and actions. Text 14. No action adheres to me, nor do I aspire for the fruits of action. For one who understands this truth about me, is freed from the entanglement of reactions to fruitive work. Finally, text 15. Indeed, the sages of ancient times attained liberation by acting with this understanding. Therefore, you should act as the ancients did, following in their footsteps. All right. So now we'll get into a little detail, and we will also come to our verse that we will chant this evening. So once again, verse 10. Free from attachment, fear, and anger. Well, that's a tall order. When I thought about where are current events to be found in the verses that we were covering in the Bhagavad-gita this evening, well, this is where I found it. Attachment, fear, and anger. For those of us who are paying attention to the news and current events this past week, we may be banging up against our attachments, our fear, and our anger. It is very easy to be angry at a president of the United States, if you identify as a patriotic American, who seems to be for some reason or other, more interested in the interests of a traditional foe than the interests of America and the ideals, I should say, that America is supposed to stand for. And there could be reasonable fear that our entire system is being undermined by the influence of a Russian asset who sits in the Oval Office. And this rolls back to our attachment to the ideal of a liberal democracy that stands for everything a totalitarian government does not. Is this bad? Is this attachment now going to be a stumbling block on the path of yoga? Is this fear, which seems perfectly legitimate, also going to be a stumbling block? Is our anger not justified within the context of yoga? Share your thoughts with me on that, and then I'll share mine. Meanwhile, their minds fully absorbed in me and fully situated within me as their shelter. Many have become purified by the fire of knowledge and have thus attained my mood of intimate affection. So bhava is the word that is, or bhavana is the word that is used to indicate this mood of intimate affection. Krishna's mood. Now, notice here in this section, really from the very beginning of this chapter to where we are now, Krishna's mood has really changed. Prior to this, he's speaking in a kind of dispassionate way about the nature of action, action informed by knowledge, the liberating effects of action informed by knowledge. But in this section, he's getting really personal. He's sharing information about himself, and he's talking about relationships and moods of relationships, his relationship as the teacher of the ancients, his relationship to those who are devoted to him. He speaks of this mood of intimate affection that is attained, that is his mood, and that is attained by those who are fully absorbed in him and see him as their ultimate shelter. So one can ask, well, why is Krishna doing this? Why is Krishna now pivoting to a more personal exchange? And what does that say about who Krishna is and what he feels towards us? So back to detachment and fearlessness and contentment as opposed to attachment and fear and anger. So these are consistent principles of spiritual life, along with absorption of one's mind in divinity. And one who understands all the ways in which divinity appears in the world and moves in the world lives in a state of spiritual consciousness. The saying is, not a blade of grass moves without the sanction of the Supreme Person. Okay, well, that means current events are getting the sanction of the Supreme Person. Things are happening in accordance with our destiny that we're responsible for. In one sense, you could say that we got the president we deserved, and now we're all up in arms. The Russians interfered with our elections. And every country in Latin America goes, mm-hmm. There's a difference between a material attachment and a spiritual attachment, a material fear and a spiritual fear, a material anger and spiritual anger. So here, Krishna is referring to material attachment. So what is a material attachment? Thinking my country is worshipable because I just happen to be born in it. I am attached to a particular way of life that is familiar to me, that I am comfortable with. Fear ultimately rolls back to fear of death, and the only thing that can die is this material body. Fear of losing one's sense of self-determination, which is the illusion that we're in control. Angry that things are not going the way we want them to go, that the universe is not aligning with our desires, which is actually precisely what happens when well, anger is what happens when the universe does not align with our desires. In fact, the intensity of our desire for something usually has a corresponding level of anger associated with it, simply because we either can't get it, or we got it and now we don't like it, or we got it but we can't keep it. This too shall pass. Words to live by, which will make a happy man sad and a sad man happy. How do we deal with this? Well, my thought about it is we're attached to the idea of liberal democracy because what comes with it is freedom to pursue one's spiritual life in the manner that one chooses. This is a key part of the liberal experiment in liberal democracy. Previously, one ran a great risk by practicing a spiritual path that the monarch did not practice. Good way to get yourself burned at the stake. And we'd like to think that we're more civilized than that now, but we're probably not. The same kind of people are probably still around. So it's reasonable to fear such people and such circumstances. So spiritual fear is fear of not being able to make spiritual advancement, not being able to be of service to others in the matter of assisting them with their spiritual advancement. So this would be a kind of transcendental fear. And transcendental anger is the kind of anger that one manifests on behalf of Krishna, or the Supreme Being, whatever your conception of a Supreme Being may be, that is under your control. That is to say, when one becomes an instrument of divine will, then one can manifest anger on behalf of divine will rather than on one's own behalf. And that anger is controlled anger as opposed to out of control anger. So all of these things can be spiritualized in some way. So freedom from attachment, fear, and anger means freedom from material attachment, material fear, material anger. And we can understand that in context, this is what Krishna is talking about, because later he's going to convince Arjuna to fight, and you can't fight if you're not angry. Arjuna will agree to be an instrument of divine will, and then Krishna will intentionally remind Arjuna of all of the injustices visited upon him by his enemies, just to get him angry so that he will fight ferociously. So, and this brings us to the verse that we are going to chant this evening, which is verse number 11 in the 4th chapter. And as is the usual way we do things, I'm going to chant, and you are going to chant back. So here we go. Ye yatamam prapadyante tanstataiva bhajamyaham mama vartmanu vartante manushya parta sarvashaha. Very good. Here's our translation. However one approaches me, I respond to them in just that way. Everyone in all circumstances follows my path, O son of Pritha. So here's how we can think about this. The word Krishna means all attractive. The power of attraction in any person, place, or thing is Krishna. Krishna's power of attraction, because everything is part of Krishna. There's nothing separate from Krishna. There is nothing but Krishna and Krishna's energies. The sum total of reality can be summed up just that simply. There is the Supreme Person and the unlimited and inconceivable energies of that Supreme Person. And the particular name or designation for that person in the Bhagavad-gita is Krishna, which means all attractive. Therefore, we can understand that everyone is looking for Krishna. Everyone is trying to approach Krishna. And there are unlimited means of approach. There are also unlimited means of going the other way. So everyone in all circumstances follows Krishna's path. That path, which way that path goes depends on what is the desire of the person. So if one is desiring to approach Krishna in a friendly way, in a mood of devotion or in a mood of seeking shelter, in a mood of friendship, then Krishna personally, since Krishna is getting personal here, will respond in precisely that way. He'll be your friend. He'll be your shelter. On the other hand, if someone wants to distance themselves from Krishna, then Krishna will oblige and send them on a path that takes them in the opposite direction from him. Either way, since there's nothing but Krishna and Krishna's energies, one moves through Krishna's energies. The energy of the material world is Krishna's energy, therefore we are moving through Krishna's energy, whether we know it's his energy or not. We may go down a path where we deny that there is any such person or thing as a supreme being. This is all just here. We're entitled to enjoy it. You only live once. If you're James Bond, you only live twice. So this can also be understood as an invitation from Krishna to approach him. And in whatever way you feel inspired to approach him, then he'll reciprocate with you in exactly that way. They're unlimited living beings, and Krishna is unlimited. Therefore, there are unlimited ways in which Krishna can engage with us. If we hear a little bit about Krishna's life before he speaks the Bhagavad-gita, we can also find out something about the nature of the possible relationships one can have. For example, he appears as a child. He's got a mother and a father. They want to take care of God. So God will allow himself to be taken care of. This is actually a very radical idea, especially from the standpoint of traditional Western theology. We never think of God as a child who you would take care of and feel like you have to take care of him, or how will he get along? You know, how will he eat if you don't feed him, etc. Krishna goes out in the middle of the night to dance with the gopis. So this is the famous Rasa Leela dance. And it's understood that the many gopis whom Krishna expands himself to dance with are all have a different mood. And so therefore he's manifesting a mood that matches theirs to reciprocate with their mood perfectly. So these are possibilities. So Casey, I see your question. Does this relate to Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan? Can you qualify it a little bit more for me so I know exactly what this is? Are you talking about this idea of approaching Krishna from any direction? Is that what you're referring to in terms of yeah, okay, got it. So yes, it does. Because if one wants to disappear from the standpoint of like not really being a person anymore and merge into the undifferentiated oneness of being, to merge directly into Krishna's energy of Brahman, then yes, Krishna will reciprocate by offering you a path that will take you into this merging. If one is like a mystic yogi who wants to see Paramatma, the Lord within the heart, then Krishna will give that yogi a path by which they can come to that aspect of himself and be fully cognizant directly, by direct perception, experience that Paramatma within the heart. And then Bhagavan, Krishna will then, for one who wants to engage in devotional service in a personal relationship, then that's Bhagavan, and Krishna will provide a means by which one can approach him in his direct personal form. And the different approaches, like in bhakti, would be our relationship with Bhagavan. Yes, bhakti is, or devotional service, is specifically directed to Bhagavan. And bhakti includes everything. So Brahman realization, Paramatma realization, and Bhagavan realization. Realization of Krishna's energies and how everything is ultimately and actually spiritual. Realization of Krishna within the heart, one's own heart, and the heart of all living beings, and permeating the entire cosmic manifestation. And then realization of the personal form of the Supreme Person. All of that is included in the path of devotional service to the personal form, the person, the ultimate person, Krishna. And as we will see, as we move further, along in the Bhagavad-gita, that Krishna will keep working up to this point, that he will emphasize bhakti as being the ultimate fulfillment of each of the other paths, karma yoga, jnana yoga, and raja yoga. You're welcome. Okay. We move on to the next verse, verse number 12. In pursuit of the perfection of their worldly desires, people worship their deities through acts of sacrifice. In the human realm, such fruitive work is quickly met with success. So here's a little bit of symbolic language. Literally, you might think, all right, now Krishna is back to the demigods. He's back to, worshiping a particular demigod that we see about in the Vedic tradition. You want something in particular, you want great wealth, you worship Kuvera, the treasurer of the demigods. Or you worship the goddess of fortune. If you want to be very famous, then you worship somebody else. If you want to be very powerful, you can worship Vayu, the god of the wind. Ladies who want a nice husband will worship Katyayani. I'm not sure who men are supposed to worship if they want a nice wife. But you get the idea. So this is the Vedic tradition. There's got a demigod for every occasion. All right, let's think of this in a more modern way. Who do you worship? Who do you idolize, or who do others idolize in the course of trying to fulfill their desires? You want to be like so-and-so. You find role models. Or you look to someone and you worship them in some form or fashion. You become devoted to someone who represents everything that you desire. I'm going up to Saratoga Springs in August. I'm going to be doing a workshop up at Yoga Mandali. And I haven't been to Saratoga Springs in 44 years. And I looked just to see, because I just kind of thought it was almost like right to the day. And sure enough, I'll be there like one day shy of exactly 44 years from the last time I was in Saratoga Springs, at the Saratoga Center of the Performing Arts, I think it's what it's called, to see Joni Mitchell. And it was a great show. I saw her twice. And she was amazing. And in the course of just doing the research to remember, what was the exact date of that show? I saw websites where people had comments about, how they were so devoted to her that these were like practically prayers of worship, prayers of gratitude, that sort of thing. Because for a lot of people, Joni Mitchell represents a particular ideal or aspiration. Some people might worship some self-help guru who approaches success in a way that resonates with them. Or an author of a book that show them the way to overcome some obstacle in their life, etc. So, who do we idolize? Who do we, in some cases, wish that we were? Last week, I spoke about how Krishna shows up in by his own will, by his own power. He's not obliged to accept a material body the way we were. And if we had our own power to show up according to our own will, I suggested that maybe I wouldn't have shown up in quite exactly the way that I've shown up. I would have maybe thought of improvements I could have made. I still would have wanted to teach the Bhagavad-gita. I just would have looked like Sean Connery while I was doing it and driven a Maserati, I'm sorry, an Aston Martin instead of a Prius. But I'd still want to be teaching the Bhagavad-gita. Anyway, so we can think about this like that. You know. And then in the human realm, such fruitive work is quickly met with success. It's a lot easier to be materially successful than spiritually successful. Our spiritual aspirations are actually, you know, the most difficult thing. And Krishna doesn't have the same sense of time that we have. We think it takes a whole lifetime to accomplish something, but our lifetime is very short. From Krishna's point of view, a single breath of Vishnu is equal to 3.11 trillion births and deaths. Verse 13, I created the 4 social orders of human society, which are divided according to the qualities one acquires and the actions one performs. You should know that although I am the creator of this system, I have no position within it, for I am eternally transcendental to such qualities and actions. So here we find again the Vedic social structure. Brahmins, spiritually enlightened intellectuals acting as the head of society, Kshatriya, rulers, warriors, and administrators who are the arms and chest of society, the Vaishyas, the entrepreneurs, the belly of the social body, and finally the Sudras, artists, artisans, and laborers, the legs of the social body. And Krishna appears in a Kshatriya family, but ends up being raised by a Vaishya family, and Arjuna, of course, is a Kshatriya. The important thing here is that these divisions are designed according to one's qualities and one's actions, as opposed to one's birth. So it's not like Krishna invented the caste system, and translations of the Gita that speak about this as the caste system do us all a bit of a disservice, because the system of Varna is a social division of society that is not based on the same things that the modern, relatively modern caste system is based on. It's a naturally occurring system due to its divine origin. In other words, you can go to any society, no matter how classless it's supposed to be, and you will still see people who just naturally fall into these 4 divisions. Krishna is, even though he appears and plays the role like a actor on a stage, as a prince in his adulthood and as a cowboy in his childhood, he is actually above the whole thing. This is another way that Krishna stands within his own energy and is yet not affected by that energy. And this reflects back to what I mentioned last week from this book that I've been reading, Falling Upward, and this quote. Both Plato and Jefferson said that democracy was not really the best form of government, it was just the safest. A truly wise monarch would probably be the most effective at getting things done. And we see that even when a aspiring monarch doesn't have our best interests at heart, still people gravitate towards this idea. Anyway, the author Richard Rohr added a parenthetical, please don't send hate mail, because he knows his audience is not particularly anxious to get back to a system of the divine right of kings. All right, 14. No action adheres to me, nor do I aspire for the fruits of action. So this corresponds to the Yoga Sutras, where Patanjali says the same exact thing. There's no karma for Ishvara. There are no latent impressions that oblige him to act in any particular way. There is no aspiration that Ishvara is pursuing. And one who understands this truth about me is freed from the entanglement of reactions to fruitive work. So this is really cool. The logic of this is that if you meditate on someone who is free, you also become free. That you attain the qualities of the object of your meditation. So if you're meditating on Krishna, then you attain the same qualities of Krishna, namely pure spiritual consciousness, liberated from all karmic obligations and karmic impressions. So this same condition of free from karma and no aspiration, no worldly aspiration essentially, is what one attains from one's meditation on Krishna. And then, finally, 15, indeed, the sages of ancient times attained liberation by acting with this understanding. Therefore, you should act as the ancients did, following in their footsteps. So, this now, in the elliptical pattern of the Gita, reflects back on what we started with in the beginning of this chapter, the idea that we follow in the footsteps of those who went before, or in other words, what the ancient teachers taught and passed down to their students who then became teachers, et cetera, et cetera. This system of knowledge still works. And by following in the footsteps of those who approached transcendental knowledge in the same way, one acquires that same transcendental knowledge and acquires the same result, namely liberation. So we model the behavior of the sadhus. And by doing so, we acquire the same characteristics of the sadhus. We acquire the same knowledge and we acquire the same state of being. And that takes us to the end. Yoga of knowledge. One of these days, I will remember to change what tonight's program was, because that was last week's program. Tonight's program was actually consistent principles of spiritual life, the unlimited varieties of reciprocation as one approaches Krishna, Krishna's ability to respond in any way, and modeling the behavior of the sadhus, following in the footsteps of the ancients, still completely relevant today, because transcendental knowledge is still relevant and the practical application of that knowledge in the modern world is still available to us. So, with that, I ask you this very important question. Any questions? Please state your question in the form of a question. And if you have no question now, but you do have a question later, then you know where to find me. Hari@harikirtan.com is the email address for you to send your questions my way. If you will be in the vicinity of Cumberland, Maryland, July 28th, 29th, as well as Friday night, I believe from 6 to 7. I will be there. I'll be teaching a yoga class at, where am I going to teach a yoga class?
Allegheny Arts Council.
At the Allegheny Arts Council. And then Saturday and Sunday, an immersive workshop on sharing yoga philosophy. This is both for yoga teachers and for yoga enthusiasts who want to understand more about yoga philosophy and know how to share it with your friends and family and your dog or cat, as the case may be. And as I mentioned earlier, I will be at Yoga Mandali in Saratoga Springs, New York, for an Integrating Yoga Philosophy into Classes and Workshops workshop. And that's very specifically for yoga teachers who want to learn this particular skill. Next week, we will continue with Chapter 4, Knowledge of Action. We'll talk about action in inaction and inaction in action. What could be more fun than that? Or confusing? In fact, we'll talk about that. Even Krishna thinks it's confusing for people. He's not confused, but he wouldn't be surprised if we were confused, and he'll do his best to sort it out, and I will do my best to be a transparent via medium for that information. We'll also talk about the life-changing magic of tidying up. That's right. Marie Kondo makes her appearance in the Bhagavad-gita next week. And how to burn up your karma. We will cover verses 16 through 24, chapter 4, the Bhagavad-gita. Okay, last call for comments, questions, complaints. Because we've reached the end of the line for another episode of our Bhagavad-gita Satsang. So thank you all very, very much for spending your time with me this evening, or whenever you are spending your time with me. I'm always very, very grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. And Erica, I am also finally, I'm glad that you had a chance to catch up and be with us live this evening. So thank you so much for doing so. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. All right. There it is. End meeting for all.